I love to read stories. I'm not very good at making them up, but I love to read them. So I want to share them with you. We're going to start reading Skandar and the Unicorn Thief by A.F. Steadman. It looks like a really fun adventure, and you're welcome to come along with me. All right, I'm ready to start. I've got the book. I've got my drink of choice for the day. Not sponsored. Anyways, let's open up the island. Ooh, look, we got a map here. Cool, huh? All right. The prologue. The cameraman heard the unicorns before he saw them. High-pitched, screeching, murderous growls, the gnashing of bloody teeth. The cameraman smelled the unicorns before he saw them. Rancid breath, rotting flesh, the stench of immortal death. The cameraman felt the unicorns before he saw them too. Somewhere deep in his bones, their putrid hooves thundered, and the panic began to rise, until every nerve, every cell, told him to run. But he had a job to do. The cameraman watched the unicorns emerge over the brow of the hill. 8 of them, malevolent gulls galloping across the grassland, skeletal wings unfurling, taking flight. Like the eye of a shadowy storm, black smoke swirled around them, thunder rumbled in their wake, and bolts of lightning hit the earth far below their fearsome feet. 8 ghostly horns sliced through the air as the monsters howled their war cry. The villagers began to scream. Some tried to run, but it was far, far too late for that. The cameraman was standing in the village square when the first unicorn landed. It snorted sparks and pawed the ground, havoc and mayhem in every rattling breath. The cameraman kept filming despite his shaking hands. He had a job to do. The unicorn lowered its giant head, the razor-sharp horn pointing directly at the lens. Its bloodshot eyes met the cameraman's, and he saw in them only destruction. There was no hope for this village now, no hope for him. But then, he'd always known he wouldn't survive a wild unicorn stampede. He just hoped the camera footage would make it to the mainland. Because once you see a wild unicorn, you're already dead. The man lowered his camera, hoping that his job was done, because unicorns don't belong in fairy tales. They belong in nightmares. Ooh, that gets you good, huh? All right. Chapter 1, The Thief. Skandar Smith stared at the unicorn poster opposite his bed. It was light enough outside now to see the unicorn's wings outstretched mid-flight, shining silver armor covering most of his body, exposing only his wild red eyes, an enormous jaw, and a sharp gray horn. New Age Frost had been Skandar's favorite unicorn ever since his rider, Aspen McGrath, had qualified for the Chaos Cup 3 years ago, and Skandar thought that today, in this year's race, they just might have a chance of winning. Skandar had received the poster for his 13th birthday 3 months before. He gazed at it through the bookshop window, imagining that he was New Age Frost's rider, standing just outside the poster frame, ready to race. Skandar had felt really bad asking his dad for it. For as long as he could remember, they'd never had much money. He didn't usually ask for anything. But Skandar had wanted the poster so badly, and a crash came from the kitchen. On any other day, Skandar would have jumped out of bed, terrified there was a stranger in the flat. Usually he or his sister, Kenna, asleep in the bed opposite, was in charge of making breakfast. Skandar's dad wasn't lazy. It wasn't that. He just found it hard to get up most days, especially when he didn't have a job to go to. And he hadn't had one of those in a while. But today was no ordinary day. Today was race day. And for Dad, the Chaos Cup was better than birthdays. Better even than Christmas. Are you ever going to stop staring at that stupid poster? Kenna groaned. Dad's making breakfast. Skandar said, hoping this would cheer his sister up. I'm not hungry. She turned and faced the wall, her brown hair poking out from underneath the duvet. There's no way Aspen and New Age Frost will win today, by the way. I thought you weren't interested. I'm not, but Kenna rolled back again, squinting at Skandar through the morning light. You've got to look at the stats, Scar. Frost swing beats per minute are only about average for the 25 competing. Then there's allied the problem of their allied element being water. What problem? Skandar's heart was singing, even though Kenna was insisting Aspen and Frost wouldn't win. She hadn't talked about unicorns for so long he'd almost forgotten what it was like. When they were younger, they'd argued constantly about what their elements would be if they became unicorn riders. Kenna always said she'd be a fire wielder, but Skandar could never decide. Have you ever forgotten your hatchery classes? Aspen and New Age Frost are still water allied, right? And then there are two air wielders among the favorites, Emma Templeton and Tom Nazari. We both know air has advantages over water. Skandar's sister was leaning on one elbow now, her thin, pale face alight with excitement, her hazel hair and eyes wild. Kenna was a year older than Skandar, but they looked so similar that they'd often been mistaken for twins. You'll see, Skandar said, grinning. Aspen's learned from her and other Chaos Cups. Aspen's learned from her other Chaos Cups. She won't just use water, she's smarter than that. Last year, she combined the elements. If I was riding New Age Frost, I'd go for lightning bolts and whirlpool attacks. Kenna's face changed at once. Her eyes dulled. The smile dropped from the corners of her mouth. Her elbow collapsed, and she turned to the wall again, gathering her coral duvet around her shoulders. Ken, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. The smell of bacon and burnt toast wafted up under the door. Skandar's stomach rumbled in the silence. Kenna, leave me alone, Scar. Aren't you going to come watch the cup with Dad and I? No answer again. Skandar dressed in the half light of the morning, disappointment and guilt tightening his throat. He shouldn't have said it. If I was writing. There'd been they'd been talking like this they'd been talking like they used to, before Kenna took the hatchery exam, before all her dreams came crashing down. Skandar entered the kitchen to the sound of sizzling eggs and blaring early cup coverage. Dad was humming, leaning over the pan. When he saw Skandar, he gave him an enormous grin. Skandar couldn't remember the last time he'd seen him smile. Dad's face fell a little. No Kenna yet? Still sleeping, Skandar lied, not wanting to spoil his good mood. She'll find this year hard, I expect. The first race since. Skandar didn't need him to finish the sentence. This was the first Chaos Cup since Kenna had failed the hatchery exam last year and lost all chance of becoming a unicorn rider. The trouble was, Dad had never acted like it was rare to pass the hatchery exam. He loved unicorns so much, he was desperate for one of his children to become a rider. He said it would fix everything, their money problems, their future, their happiness, even the days he couldn't get out of bed. Unicorns were magic after all. Don't we all look for that magic moment, that magic thing to take us out of whatever mess we're in currently in life? So Kenna's whole life he'd insisted that she'd pass the exam and go on to open the hatchery door on the island. That she was destined for a unicorn egg locked inside. That she'd make their mum proud. And it hadn't helped that Kenna had always been top of her hatchery class at Christchurch Secondary. If anyone was going to get into the island, her teacher said, it was Kenna Smith. Then she'd failed. And for months now, Skandar's dad had been telling him the same. It was possible, probable, even inevitable that he'd become a writer. And despite knowing how unusual it was, despite seeing Kenna so disappointed last year, Skandar wanted more than anything for it to be true. Your turn this year, though, eh? Dad ruffled Skandar's hair with a greasy hand. Now, the best way to make fried bread. As Dad gave him directions, Skandar nodded in all the right places, pretending he didn't already know how. Other children might have found this annoying, but Skandar was just pleased when Dad gave him a high five for getting the bread the perfect amount of crispy. Kenna didn't come out for breakfast, though Dad didn't seem to mind too much, as he and Skandar munched on sausages, bacon, eggs, beans, and fried bread. Skandar stopped himself from asking where the money for this extra food had come from. It was race day. Dad clearly wanted to forget about all that, and Skandar did too, just for today. So he grabbed the brand new bottle of mayonnaise and squeezed it over everything, grinning as it made a satisfying squelch. Can't stand that much mayonnaise. Aspen McGrath and New Age Frost. Still favorites for you then? Dad asked through a mouthful. I forgot to say, if you want to invite your friends over for the race, that's fine with me. Lots of kids do that, don't they? Don't want you to miss out. Skandar stared down at his plate. How could he even begin to explain that he didn't have any friends to invite? And worse, that it was sort of Dad's fault? The trouble was that looking after Dad when he wasn't well, not so happy, meant that Skandar missed out on a whole lot of the normal stuff you were supposed to do to make friends. He could never stay after school to mess about in the park. He didn't have pocket money to go to the amusement arcade or sneak off for fish and chips on Margate Beach. Skandar hadn't realized to begin with, but those were the times people actually made friends. Not in English class, over a stale custard cream at morning break. And looking after Dad meant that Skandar sometimes didn't have clean clothes or hadn't had time to brush his teeth, and people noticed. They always noticed and remembered. Somehow for Kenna, it hadn't been as bad. Skandar thought it helped that she was more confident than him. Whenever Skandar tried to think of something clever or funny to say, his brain jammed. It had come to him a few minutes later, but face to face with a classmate, there'd just be a weird buzzing in his head, a blankness. Kenna didn't have that problem. He'd once heard her confront a group of girls whispering about how weird Dad was. My dad, my business, she said very calmly. Stay out of it, or you'll be sorry. They're busy with their own families, Dad, Skandar mumbled eventually, feeling himself blush, which always happened when he didn't tell the whole truth. Dad didn't notice, though. He'd started stacking the plates, which was such a rare sight that Skandar blinked twice to make sure it was real. What about Owen? He's a good mate of yours, isn't he? Owen was the worst. Dad thought he was a friend because he'd once seen hundreds of notifications from him on Skandar's phone. Skandar hadn't mentioned that the messages were far from friendly. Oh yeah, he loves the Chaos Cup. Skandar got up to help. He's watching it with his grandparents though, and they live miles away. Skandar wasn't even making this up. He'd overheard Owen complaining to his crew about it. Right before he had torn 3 pages out of Skandar's math textbook, screwed them up, and thrown them in his face. Kenna, Dad shouted suddenly. It's starting any minute. When there was no answer, he disappeared into their bedroom, and Skandar sat down on the sofa, the TV coverage in full swing. A reporter was interviewing a past Chaos Cup rider in the main area, just in front of the starting bar. Skandar turned up the volume. And you think we'll see some fierce elemental battles today? The reporter's face was flushed with excitement. For sure, the rider replied, nodding confidently. There's a real mix of abilities among the competitors, Tim. People are fixating on the fire strength of Federico, Jones, and Sunset's blood. But what about Emma Templeton and Mountain Sphere? They might be air allied, but they're multi-talented. People forget that the best Chaos Cup riders excel in all four elements. They're just the one. They're not just the ones they're allied to. The four elements. They were the core of the hatchery exam. Skandar had spent hours learning which famous unicorns and riders were allied to fire, water, earth, or air, which attacks and defenses they would favor in sky battles. Nerves swooped into Skandar's stomach. He couldn't believe the exam was the day after tomorrow. Dad returned, a troubled look on his face. She'll be out in a bit, he said, standing next to Skandar on the battered old sofa. It's hard for you kids to understand, really, he sighed, staring at the screen. 13 years ago, when my generation first watched the Chaos Cup, it was enough just knowing the island existed. I was far too old to be a writer, but the race, the unicorns, the elements, it was magic for us, for me, for your mom. Skandar stayed very still, not daring to turn his head away from the screen as the unicorns entered the arena. Dad only talked about Skandar and Kenna's mom on Chaos Cup Day. By his 7th birthday, Skandar had given up asking about her any other time. Learning it made Dad angry and upset. Learning it made him disappear into his room for days. Never seen your mom so full of emotions as she was on the first day of on the as she was on the day of the first Chaos Cup. Dad continued. She sat right where you are now, smiling and crying, and holding you in her arms. Only a couple of months old you were. Skandar had heard this before, but he didn't mind one bit. He and Kenna were always desperate to hear about their mom. Grandma, Dad's mom, used to tell them about her, but they liked it best when the stories came from Dad, who had loved her most. And sometimes, when he repeated them, there were new details, like how Rosemary Smith always called him Bertie, never Robert, or the way she had liked to sing in the bath, or her favorite type of flower, pansies, or the element she liked watching best, water, and the first and last Chaos Cup she'd ever seen. I'll always remember, Dad continued, looking straight at Skandar. When that first Chaos Cup finished, your mum took your tiny hand, traced a pattern on your palm, and whispered, quiet as a prayer, I promise you a unicorn, little one. Skandar swallowed hard. Dad had never told him that story before. Maybe he'd saved it until the year of his hatchery exam. Maybe it wasn't even true. Skandar would never know whether Rosemary Smith had really promised him a unicorn because, without warning, 3 days after the mainland had watched unicorns race for the first time, Skandar's mom had died. Skandar would never have said it to Dad or even Kenna, but part of the reason he liked the Chaos Cup so much was because it made him feel close to his mom. He imagined her watching the unicorns, the excitement building in her chest, just like it was in his, and it was as though she was there with him. Kenna stomped into the room with a bowl of cereal balanced on her palm. Really, Scar? Mayonnaise at breakfast? She pointed at Skandar's smeared plate on top of the stack. I keep telling you, it's not an acceptable food, little bro. Skandar shrugged, and Kenna laughed as she squeezed onto the sofa next to him. Look at you both taking up so much room. I'll be on the floor next year, said Dad, laughing. Skandar's heart clenched. If his exam went well, he wouldn't be here next year. He'd be watching the Chaos Cup in person, on the island, and he'd have his very own unicorn. Kenna, cards are on the table. Favorite? Dad asked her, leaning around Skandar. She stared at the television, munching moodily. Earlier, she'd said Aspen and New Age Frost won't win. Skandar piped up, looking for a reaction. It worked. Maybe another year Aspen will do it, but this isn't a good race for a water wielder. Kenna tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar to Skandar that it made him feel safe, like Kenna was going to be okay, even if Skandar didn't leave her alone with Dad on the sofa next year. Skandar shook his head. I told you, Aspen isn't just going to rely on the water element. She's cleverer than that. She'll use air, fire, and earth attacks too, for sure. A rider is always best at their allied element, though. Scar. That's why it's called allied. Duh. Say Aspen did use a fire attack. It's not going to compare with anything an actual fire wielder can do, is it? All right then. Who do you think's going to win? Skandar set up as Dad turned the volume higher, commentary reaching fever pitch as the armored competitors jostled for positions behind the starting bar. Emma Templeton and Mountain's Fear, Kenneth said very quietly. 10th last year, air wielding, high stamina, brave, intelligent. She's just the kind of writer I would have been. It was the first time Skandar had heard Kenna acknowledge that she wouldn't ever be a writer. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know what. And then it was too late. So he listened to the commentator trying to fill the seconds before the race began. For any first timers just joining us, we're live from 4 Points, the island capital, and in a few moments, these unicorns will fly out of the famous arena and begin the aerial race course, a grueling 16-kilometer test of stamina and sky battle ability. Riders must stay outside the floating markers on their way around, or risk being eliminated. Not easy when 24 other competitors are trying to hit you with elemental magic and slow you down at every turn. Oh, that's the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, and they're off. Skandar watched 25 unicorns, each twice the size of a horse, explode forward as the starting bar rose above their horns. The riders' armored legs banged against their competitors on either side as they urged their unicorns on to get an early lead. Crouching low in their saddles, gathering speed, and then it was Skandar's favorite part. The unicorns began to stretch out their great feathered wings and take off, leaving the sand of the arena far below. The microphones picked up the riders as they whooped through their helmets, and it almost picked up something else. A sound that still sent shivers down Skandar's spine, though he'd heard it on every day, on race day, every year of his life. Guttural bellows from deep within the unicorn's chest, more terrifying than a lion's roar, more ancient and primal than anything he had heard on mainland. The sort of sound that made you want to run. The unicorns barged against each other in midair to get the best positions, metal armor clanking and scraping, the tips of their horns glinting in the sunlight as they tried to gore their rivals. Foam built up around their gnashing teeth and their nostrils flared red. Now they were airborne. The elemental magic lit up the sky, fireballs, dust storms, flashes of lightning, walls of water. The sky battles raged against a backdrop of fluffy white clouds. Riders' right palms glowed with elemental power as they desperately tried to fight their way along the race course. And it wasn't pretty. The unicorns kicked out at each other, tore flesh from each other's flanks with their teeth, and blasted their competitors at close range. 3 minutes in, the camera caught a unicorn and rider, hair on fire, one arm hanging uselessly, spiraling toward the ground and crash landing. Smoke billowing from the unicorn's wing and the rider's blonde head. The commentator groaned. That's Hillary Winters and Sharp Edged Lily out of the Chaos Cup this year. Looks like a broken arm, some nasty burns, and an injury to Lily's wing. The camera moved back to the leading group. Frederico Jones and Sunset's Blood were locked in a sky battle with Aspen McGrath and New Age Frost. Aspen had summoned a bow of ice and was firing arrow after arrow at Federico's armored back, trying to slow him. Federico had a flaming shield to melt the arrows, but Aspen's aim was good, and New Age Frost was catching up. Federico wasn't done, though. As Aspen flew Frost closer, flames exploded into the sky above Aspen's head. "That's a wildfire attack from Federico," the commentator sounded impressed. "Tricky at that height and speed, but oh, would you look at that?" Ice crystals were knitting in a web around New Age Frost, round Aspen, until they were sealed in a frozen cocoon so thick the wildfire couldn't touch them. Skandar saw Federico shouting in disappointment, and as he and Sunset's blood fell back with the effort of their fire attack, and Aspen burst through her ice shell to overtake. It's Tom Nazari on Devil's Own Tears in the lead, followed by Emma Templeton on Mountain's Fear. Third is Elodie Birch on River Reed Prince. And after that incredible air and water combo, New Age Frost and Aspen McGrath are now in fourth with... But it looks like Aspen is making another move. The commentator interrupted himself with voice rising. "She's picking up speed." Aspen's red hair flew out behind her. New Age Frost putting up an unbelievable burst of speed, wings blurring, barging past River Reed Prince, swerving as a lightning bolt missed Aspen by inches. Then Frost's great gray wings soared past Kenna's favorite, Mountain's Fear. Then Tom Nazari's Black Unicorn, Devil's Own Tears, and Aspen took the lead. "Yeah!" Skandar punched the air. It was a very un-Skandar thing to do, but this was incredible. Unbelievable. "I've never seen anything like it," the commentator shouted. "Look how far ahead she is." Kenna gasped, her eyes fixed on the unicorns as they approached the finish. "I don't believe it." "She's going to win by 100 meters," another commentator squealed. Skandar watched, mouth open, as New Age Frost's hooves touched down in the arena sand. Aspen pushed him forward, fierce determination in her eyes as she passed under the finishing arch. Skandar jumped up, shouting with excitement, "They won! They won! See, Kenna, I told you! I called it! I called it!" Kenna was laughing, eyes shining, and that made the victory even better. "All right, Scar, they really were something. I'll give you that. Those ice crystals, what a move! I've never seen..." "Wait!" Dad was standing close to the screen. "Something's wrong." Skandar approached him on one side, Kenna on the other. Skandar could hear the crowd screaming, but it wasn't excitement anymore. It was fear. Unicorns were no longer coming through the arch to finish the race. The commentators were silent, the footage still. There was just a single shot of the arena, as though the camera operators had abandoned their posts. A unicorn landed in the center of the arena. It didn't look like any of the others. Not Sunset's Blood, or New Age Frost, or Mountain's Fear, whose victory parade it had interrupted. This unicorn's wings were almost featherless, bat-like, and it was skeletal, half-starved. Its eyes were red, haunted slits. Blood was caked around its jaws, its teeth bared at the racers, as though daring them to attack. It wasn't until Skandar noticed the unicorn's transparent horn that he realized. "That's a wild unicorn," he breathed. "Like the ones in the old video the island showed the mainland. The one that convinced the mainland that unicorns were real all those years ago. The one where they attacked the village." "Something's wrong," Dad said again. "It can't be a wild unicorn," Kenna whispered. "It has a rider." Skandar hadn't noticed the person. At least he thought it was a person on its back. The rider wore a billowing black shroud that flapped in the breeze, the bottom tattered and torn. A wide white painted stripe obscured obscured the rider's face from the base of the throat to the very top of the head, leading into short dark hair. The unicorn reared up, pawing the air with its hooves, belching thick black smoke. Its phantom rider let out a triumphant howl. The unicorn screeched, and smoke filled the arena. Skandar watched the unicorn advance toward the Chaos Cup competitors, sparks dancing around its hooves, a jet of white from the rider's palm lighting up the screen. In the moment before the picture disappeared completely in black smoke, the rider turned and slowly and deliberately raised one long bony finger to point directly into the camera. Then there was only sound, explosions of elemental magic, unicorn screeching, more screaming from the crowd, and the unmistakable thundering of feet as islanders attempted to escape from their seats. As they crashed past the cameras, their panicked voices jumbling together, Skandar noticed two words repeated over and over: the Weaver. Skandar had never heard of the Weaver, but the more the name was whispered, shouted, screamed by the crowd, the more it began to scare him. He turned to Dad, who was still staring in disbelief at the swirling black smoke on the TV screen. Kenna beat Skandar to the question. Dad, she said quietly, who's the Weaver? Shh, he waved a hand. Something's happening. The view became clear, the smoke lifting. Half sobbing, half shouting, was coming from a figure on her knees in the sand. She was still in her armor, McGrath, painted in blue across her back, surrounded by the other riders. Please, Aspen wailed across the arena. Please bring him back. Federico, the fierceness of the race forgotten, managed to get Aspen to her feet, but she was still howling. The Weaver took him. He's gone. We won, and the Weaver... Aspen choked on the last word, tears running down her dirt-streaked face. A stern voice cracked like a whip. Get these cameras off now. The main line can't see this. Get them off now. The unicorns began to screech and bellow, the sound deafening. Their riders jumped into their saddles, trying to calm them as they reared and frothed at the mouth, looking more monstrous than Skandar had ever seen them. Only one of the 25 riders was left standing on the sand, the winning water wielder, Aspen McGrath, but her unicorn, New Age Frost, was nowhere to be seen. Who's the Weaver? Kenna asked again, her voice insistent, but nobody answered her. That'll do for today. Next time, we'll start on Chapter 2. It's called Locked Out. Enjoy.